Well, I bet you can guess what we're going to talk about. The Exodus. So last time we were talking, I believe we kind of ended talking about Joseph and his whole ordeal. If you remember, Joseph, his brothers kind of threw him in a pit and sold him into slavery. What a great family he had, you know. They sell him into slavery, and he goes to Egypt, and he serves in this guy named Potiphar's house, and then he has a problem with Potiphar's wife, and he's accused of something he didn't do, and he's thrown in prison, and he interprets some dreams, and eventually Pharaoh makes him the number 2 guy in the nation. We all know this story, and he basically saves his family and the people from starvation through the famine that comes. So that's kind of bringing us up to kind of date to where we're going to talk about Egypt. And when all of that happened, you know, this idea of people coming to Egypt with different wares and things to sell and to trade, that was a thing that was going on. And this is actually a tomb painting that shows this, and what had happened was a lot of people from the east, which would be, you know, Israel and places north of there, they would go down to Egypt and they would trade with them because the Egyptians had a lot of money. One of the things the Egyptians had was they had the Nile River, and every spring, and it was predictable that the Nile River would flood, and they would take that water. They had canals and tributaries dug all over the place, and they would take all of that water and they would store it in areas, and they would farm with it, and other lands, you know, they relied on rainfall for their crops, but Egypt wasn't like that. They relied on the Nile. The Nile flooded every spring, and Egypt had abundant crops every spring, and because of that consistency, they became a wealthy and powerful nation. But for a long time, pretty much Egypt was not. They had this big desert area over here between them and the other nations, which made it really hard to march an army over there. But eventually, this group called the Hyksos, which means shepherd kings, they came over into Egypt, and they were able to take control of the country for a period of time. And it's my belief that this was who was in charge during this time of Joseph. But you know, I have that belief based on some of the information which I'm going to share with you here this evening, but there's no way to be sure. And do you think the Egyptians would have recorded this taking over of their country by this foreign power? Probably not. It's interesting when we study ancient history that it wasn't until the Greeks, Herodotus was the first historian that recorded history as it was. Right? When he recorded history, if something bad happened to the Greeks, he recorded that. But that was not the way things were done. Usually, when history was done, they only recorded the good things. And if you wanted to find a bad thing about a country like Egypt, you might have to find some records from another country that would talk about it. And we do have some of those. So that the Egyptians, they don't have any mention of these Hyksos, but some of these other nations do. And that's how we actually know about them. So they came in there, these shepherd kings, and they were kind of ruling the roost for a period of time. And because they were from this area over here, they were Semitic people, they were probably more apt to accept the Israelites, accept Joseph, accept these shepherds. And the Hyksos, they brought a lot of innovations to Egypt. their weaving technologies and musical instruments. Probably the most important thing was the horse and the chariot. That was a thing that they brought over there. And that was probably one of the major reasons they were able to defeat the Egyptians, because they had this technology that the Egyptians didn't have. They also had these composite bows. So, what they would do is they would take different materials and bind them together, glue them together. You think, oh, how did they have glue? Well, if you take like horse hooves and boil them down, that actually turns into a glue. It's called hide glue. You can still buy it today. It's really strong stuff. They had that back then. They found hide glue in the pyramids. Been around for a long time. Super strong glue that people made on natural things. So they were able to use that and different materials, and they'd make a bow that was way better than any natural material. So the Hyksos had some different technologies. That's why they were able to take over in Egypt. But eventually, the Egyptians in this area here, which would be I believe that would be the north, I think. I think the Nile River flows to the south.
It flows to the north, out to the Mediterranean Sea.
Yeah, it flows to the north. So this is the south.
Yeah.
Yes. See, you know what they need on this map? One of those a compass. They need that, right? So, at any rate, the original Egyptian pharaohs were still in control over here, and eventually they were able to throw these Hyksos out of Egypt, and they kept on going into the land of Canaan, and they kind of were able to take over that area as well. And one of the most important things the Egyptians were able to do was this area right here. And there's this place called Megiddo. The Egyptians were able to control that, because one of the things here is there's a road. There are 3 roads that go this way. And of course, this way, there's Mesopotamia. There's a lot of wealth over there. So that would be an area you would be trying to move goods over to. Well, the road that would be the easiest road was this road here called the Way of the Sea. It was nice and flat, but it had this one spot which was like a pinch point called Megiddo. There was another road that went through the mountains. It's kind of hard to move stuff through the mountains. That was a hard route. And then there was another road called the Way of the Kings, but you'd have to cross the desert. That was another hard route. So people like to go on this Way of the Sea, and this is what that looks like. Right? So that's Megiddo. So basically, if you were, that's the road going through there. If you were a country, and if you could control this thing, you could control all the traffic on this road. You could control the trade. You could control which armies are going back and forth from there. So it's a really important thing to control, and the Egyptians had control of that. So they were able to tax people. And taxing people is a really important thing, right? If you want to raise some money. And this is a tomb painting basically showing these Asiatics, or the Semitic people from this area, paying tribute to the Egyptians. Now, the way that the Egyptians did it was they didn't go into the land. They didn't set up garrisons and leave soldiers in here and do whatever they could to directly control things. What they did was they just said, listen, every year you guys are going to owe us some money. And as long as you keep giving us that money, we're going to leave you alone. But as soon as you stop giving us that money, we're going to go up there and you and I are going to have a big problem. And that's how they dealt with things. And that worked for a long time. Worked for a very long time. The problem is they're not really monitoring the situation. And that got out of control as we study through history. We figure that out. The Egyptians, they were a group of people, a culture that was you know, they were very advanced. One of the things we sometimes forget, these weren't white people, right? So they were, you know, Egypt is close to Africa. They were a darker skinned people that lived there. This is actually a cave painting, or a tomb painting here of Nefertari, one of the queens. And here's some Egyptians. I guess they're in school here, but the idea is they had a pretty advanced education system. Anybody know what that thing is?
Rosetta Stone.
The Rosetta Stone. Now it's got 3 things on it, and this was an important thing. Napoleon found this thing, or his army did. And eventually, if you know anything about Napoleon, he kind of got his butt whooped, right? So the British ended up with it. And what they did back then was they took rubbings of this. You know, they put like rice paper on it and take a pencil and go over it. And different scholars throughout the world had copies of this thing. And what they found was that there's 3 languages here. One was hieroglyphs. That's this up here. They didn't know how to read that. This thing down here, this was Coptic. I think it's up there. Dometic is what they called it. That was like phonetic Egyptian. Another way of writing Egyptian. They don't know how to read that. This time didn't know how to read that either. But this down here, this is Greek. And they knew how to read that. And they translated this first. And what they figured out was these were all the same message. And they were able to translate the Dometic first, and then eventually they were able to translate the hieroglyphs. Hieroglyphs are interesting. I don't think I have a slide about this. I don't. There's several thousand hieroglyphic characters versus how many English characters are there? 26, right? That's a big difference. And you'd think, man, that would be impossible to learn how to read that. How many Chinese characters do you think there are? How many?
Couple hundred?
Oh no, there's like thousands. Like 50,000, some crazy. I guess most Chinese people have a working knowledge of like 3,000 characters. So I guess when we think about it that way in modern day, you know, there are people that can read and understand Chinese. So it's really not that big of a stretch. So it's funny, it's kind of, if you look at Chinese characters and you look at hieroglyphs, you know, there's some similarities actually, how they look. So at any rate, that was an important thing. So when we learned how to do that, of course, now you can go into a pyramid, or you can read all these ancient writings, and there's lots of ancient Egyptian writings because they were all stuck in an arid place where there wasn't a lot of rain or anything. So all this stuff survived. The Egyptians, they had game. This is out of King Tut's tomb. There's a game board. Just, you know, pretty amazing art when you look at stuff. These are tomb paintings. But so Egypt is this pretty advanced culture, and they're in this situation where they threw out these shepherd kings. But what they're left with is all of these other Semitic people, right? The Jews that are living among them, and what do you do with those people? Right? In fact, there could have been more of them than there were the Egyptians. So they're kind of worried about that. So they put them to work, right? So they put them to work making bricks, and this is actually a tomb painting that depicts that. And when they got kind of worried about the population of the Hebrews, the Pharaoh said, you know what? We need to get rid of some of these people. So he makes an edict. He says, well, all the boys that are born, kill them, right? Only leave the girls alive. But the Hebrew midwives wouldn't do that because they feared God. They said, oh, these Egyptian women are tough. They have the babies before we can even get to them. So that's there. He says, when you were helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on delivery stool, if you see a baby, kill it. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt told them. They let the boys live. So that was kind of a bad situation that was going on there. And eventually there was a couple who had a baby boy, and this baby boy happened to be Moses. And they knew they had to do something, so his parents decided to take their chances and just put him in the river in a basket. And luckily for him, Pharaoh's daughter found him. And she took him and raised him up in her own house and gave him this name Moses, which is not a Hebrew name, right? That's an Egyptian name, Moses. And then Moses grew up, and he was out one day taking a walk, and he sees his brethren getting mistreated, so he kills this Egyptian. And everybody found out about it, and he had to run away. So he runs away up into the mountains, and he becomes a shepherd up there. And he does that for a long period of time, about 40 years. And then one day he's out in the field looking, and he sees something on fire. But it's a weird thing on fire because it won't burn up. I don't know if you guys ever looked at a fire, sat around a campfire, you got to keep putting wood on there, right? And eventually it goes out. Well, this thing wasn't doing that. So Moses, that made him curious. So he goes over to look at it, and it's the Lord, right? And the Lord says, take your sandals off because the ground you're on is holy ground. Right? So God talks to him and tells him that he needs to go back to Egypt and talk to the Pharaoh and bring the people out. And of course we all know the story where he doesn't want to do it because he's not a good speaker. So God tells them, hey, take your brother Aaron with you. He's a good speaker. So they go to see the Pharaoh, and they tell him, look, God says that you need to let the people go so they can go worship him for a few days. So Pharaoh says, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, you guys go ahead. No, he doesn't say that at all. He says, no, I'm not doing that. He goes, in fact, I'm not going to give the people straw now to make the bricks. I'm going to make them get that as well. There are apparently some buildings in this area in Ramses where they were building this thing where there were layers of bricks with no straw in them, which would seem to back up what was going on here, right? So that's where we read about the 12 plagues, the 10 plagues, right? So these 10 different plagues that he sends. And each one of these things, Pharaoh, his heart, it says God hardens his heart. Why would God do that? Or did God physically do that? How did that work?
I think there were some times where it said Pharaoh hardened his heart. Sometimes the Lord hardened his heart.
Yeah. I always took at it this way is, it's the same way, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, their hearts, they saw Jesus perform miracles. Well, let's think about Malchus. They're in the garden. Peter cuts off Malchus's ear with a sword, and Jesus heals him right there. Why didn't they just stop and go, what? Now wait a second, maybe we're off on this. They didn't do that because their hearts were hardened. And I think with the Pharaoh, with God and the Pharaoh, he knew the things that the Pharaoh would rebel against. And he didn't have to physically make Pharaoh's heart hard, but he put the obstacles in his way that he knew that's what would happen. Right? Pharaoh still made the choice. Eventually, the last plague is the death of the firstborn, and the Pharaoh decides to let the people go finally. Now, which way did they go? Hard to know. That's a long time ago, thousands of years ago. There are lots. That's why, see all these different lines? These are different proposed routes of the Exodus. We're not really sure which one it was. And it probably doesn't really matter that much which one it was. We just know that, they were in Egypt and they went to the promised land. There are some things that maybe we can some landmarks we might be able to pick out, but not a whole lot of them. One thing we know is we don't know when it happened, right? We have no idea when the Exodus happened. Now there's this stele here, which is just a rock with some writing on it, right? Where they, just like the Rosetta Stone, where they recorded some important thing. They date this thing to around 1200 BC, and this stele mentions Israel as being a nation, probably sometime around the Judges when this happened. And the thing we can gather from this is in 1200 BC, Israel was established already. So the Exodus happened before that. That's all we can tell from that. We don't know what year it happened, but we know it happened before this because at this point they're already a nation, right? So there's this translation I made of this, right? It says Israel is laid waste, bare of seed, right? That's not recorded in Judges, but was probably during that time. All right, so the Exodus, they leave Egypt. God goes ahead of them in a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. Right? He goes in front of the people. They come to the Red Sea or the Sea of Reeds, depending on the translation you use. God parts the water, and they walk across on dry ground. And of course, Pharaoh follows him, and Pharaoh's army is killed when they do that because God brings the water back. Where exactly did that happen? Don't know. No way to really tell. You've got these two. See these two arms here. One is the Gulf of Suez. Now today there's a canal through here called the Suez Canal because here's the Red Sea. And here's the Mediterranean, so now you can take ships all the way through. That wasn't that way back then. And then you've got this other Gulf of Aqaba. Of course, they probably called all of this the Red Sea. Which spot it happened at, we have no idea. And it doesn't really matter, right? So they left there, and they camped at a spot called Marah. No idea where that's at. But one thing we do know is there was bitter water there, and how did Moses fix the bitter water?
He put a tree in it.
He put a tree in it. That's how he fixed it, right? I wouldn't try that today, but back then, with God's help, that worked, right? Then they camped at another spot where there were a bunch of springs and 70 palm trees, and they camped near water there, and they sat out, and after a while they started to complain because they didn't have any food, or they got sick of the food that they had. And this was a constant thing with the Israelites. In fact, that's why this generation of people didn't make it to the promised land, because they could not put their trust in God. Over and over, every test they were given, they failed. Right? So they complained about different things. So that's where Moses strikes the rock and water comes out and the people are able to drink. And they left there and they camped in front of this big mountain, Mount Sinai. Now, here's another thing. We have no idea where Mount Sinai is for sure. There's a lot of mountains in that area. There are some different ones that people traditionally say is Mount Sinai, but nobody knows for sure which one it is. If we knew for sure what it was, what would we do with it? Yeah, we'd make some big deal. We'd have something up there, right? And people would have pilgrimages to there because that's what we do, right? That could be one. This could be another one. There's another mountain that could be Mount Sinai. There's another one that could be Mount Sinai. Not really sure, but here's what happened. They go to Mount Sinai, wherever that was at, and Moses and who go up the mountain? Joshua. Moses and Joshua go up the mountain. Boy, I didn't think I'd ever get mad on a Bible trivia thing. Wow. So the Moses and Joshua has to wait like kind of He's not allowed to go all the way up. In fact, you see these two characters here? There's Moses, he's got his 10 commandments, and there's Joshua. Right, so they're coming down off the mountain, and of course they come down the mountain and they see the people doing all sorts of crazy things. And Moses is so mad, he breaks those tablets of the law that God just gave him. They broke the law and Moses broke the law. I always thought that was kind of an interesting thing to think. There's a lesson in there somewhere. So, anyways, he comes down here and he ends up grinding up that thing and making the people drink the water that he ground it up in. And that was part of their penitence. And he goes back up onto the mountain and he gets another copy of the 10 Commandments. And the law that he's given is way more detailed than just 10 commands. God has a law for everything that they're going to do. This is the tabernacle. Tabernacle was just kind of like a mobile temple. That's what it was. So God had all these different instructions of exactly how that thing was going to be built, what was in it, everything that was in front of it, how the people were going to camp around it, where the openings were, just anything you could think of. God had already figured it all out. They just had to carry it out. And God selected certain men and gave them the pattern. Somehow God miraculously gave them the pattern that the craftsmen would know how to build these things. So that's the tabernacle. This thing was in existence for a long, long time. When we think in the Bible, you think about Samuel, right? He's at the tabernacle. Remember Samuel's wicked sons? He's at the tabernacle. That's where they're at. They're not at the temple. This thing was in existence for a long, long period of time. And again, this is kind of a map that just kind of illustrates all of the directions of how the people were supposed to set up this thing and where they were supposed to camp at. And at this point, this first promise of Israel has been fulfilled. See, the Israelites are now their own separate nation. They've separated themselves from the Egyptians. How many of them do you think there are?
Over 1 million.
Over 1 million for sure. It said there were 600,000 men, not counting women and children. So some people say it could be 2 or 3 million. Hard to say, but there were over 1 million for sure. You got 1 million people. That's a pretty good number of people. So that's our lesson this evening. I got this graphic up here. You may have seen this before. I like this because when we talk about salvation, I always think about salvation having 2 parts. It has some stuff that God did and some stuff that we have to do. I think this illustrates this. I was recently studying with a guy and he was telling me about the Romans road to salvation. Have you ever heard somebody talk about that? That's a thing a lot of like Baptists and different people like to believe in. They'll use different scriptures out of the book of Romans to come up with a plan of salvation, which basically uses a verse out of Romans chapter 3 to show that we're all sinners, and it uses a couple other verses to illustrate that to basically become a child of God, that the only thing you have to do is have faith. But one of the things that I think is often missed when people come up with some doctrine based on something like the book of Romans is they may miss the fact that the letter to Romans was written to Christians, right? The people that were being written to were already Christians. And if you want to figure out how to become a Christian, I'm going to tell you that there are nobody that was converted to Christ in any of the epistles. If you start at Romans and read through Revelation, you will not find one person that was converted to Christ. Not one. And if you start in Matthew and read all the Gospels, you will not find one person that was converted to Christ. Because they couldn't be, because Jesus hadn't died yet. Right? So the first 4 Gospels, there's no Christians in there because you didn't have a Savior yet. And the epistles, those books were written to Christians. And the only book that we can ever find out about how to become a Christian, we see example, it's all in one book, and that's the book of Acts. The book of Acts has 11 different conversion stories. 11 people were converted. And it would be worth your time to memorize this. They're in Acts chapter 2, 8, 9, 10, 11, 16, 18, 19, and 20. That's every conversion in the book of Acts. And if you ever get a chance to study with somebody and you're talking about what it takes to become a Christian, just open up to one of those chapters and find one of those conversions and just go through it, because they all start the same way and they all end the same way. They all start with faith and they all end with baptism, right? And you can talk to somebody about salvation just looking at those things. So there's one this evening that is not a Christian, although I know everybody personally in here is a Christian. But if anybody has a need, maybe you need some prayers, you can come forward while we stand and while we sing.